All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Adam Kosto, chair of the history department at Columbia University. I was prepared to be really enthusiastic about being my first in-person academic event in 2 years.
We're still excited.
Whoa, the table is in person. There are 4 people in the room, but there are a lot of you out there who are still in little Zoom boxes, and we welcome you. And with any luck, next time, there'll be more of you here in the room with us, and we can get back to what used to be normal. So anyway, before I start, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event, ISERP, the deans of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Society of Fellows, and myself as chair of the history department. I apparently contributed to this. Anyway, we're here to celebrate the publication of the new book by my colleague and friend, Hannah Farber. Professor Farber received a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 2014, and then after a 3-year stint at Boston College, she joined the Columbia History Department in 2017, where she's an assistant professor of history specializing in early American history. Last year, she was the recipient of an extraordinarily ill-timed NEH Fellowship at the New York Historical Society. Her research has appeared in the William and Mary Quarterly, the Journal of the Early Republic, Early American Literature, New England Quarterly, and Early American Studies, the last of which awarded her the Best Article Prize in 2019. And of course, there's the work that we will be discussing today, Underwriters of the United States, How Insurance Shaped the American Founding, published in the Distinguished Omohundro Institute series by the University of North Carolina Press. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, which doesn't get nearly as much ink as it should here, Hannah.
No.
Although I suppose that its insurance capital of the world days were a later development after the days of the not exactly notorious Eliphalet Terry. But the story that you tell here of the deep penetration of the insurance industry in the politics, economy, law, society, and culture of early America certainly helps me make sense of a lot of the weirdness of my former hometown. Anyway, the way this works is that Professor Farber will talk about the book for 10 minutes or so, and then we will hear the reactions to the work of 3 scholars, all of whom are in a position to offer much less parochial responses than I have done. And then there is some Baroque method of fielding questions, both from the people in the audience and the people online, which we will navigate. The first respondent is from my current hometown. Emma Hart is professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, whose faculty she joined just a year ago, I think, after 20 Andrews. Her day job is as the Richard S. Dunn Director of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, a wide-ranging scholar of early North America and the early modern Atlantic world generally. She's the author of 2 major monographs, Building Charleston, Town and Society in the 18th Century British Atlantic World from 2010, and Trading Spaces, the Colonial Marketplace and the Foundations of American Capitalism in 2019. Her particular interest in urban history led to the founding of the Global Urban History Project online, and grounds one of her current projects, A Deep History of America's Urban-Rural Divide in an Atlantic Context. So we're honored to welcome her to Columbia. Our other 2 respondents are local. Professor Charly Coleman is also a colleague and friend from the history department here. He's a leading historian of the French Revolutionary period and the European Enlightenment, who does fascinating work at the intersection of religion, philosophy, and particularly pertinent for today's discussion, political economy. His first monograph, The Virtues of Abandon, an Anti-Individualist History of the French Enlightenment from 2014, was awarded the Wiley Prize in French Cultural Studies. And just last year, there appeared his marvelously insightful The Spirit of French Capitalism, Economic Theology in the Age of Enlightenment. He's continuing to explore the history of economic theology in his current research on church property, paper money, and civic religion in the age of the French Revolution. And again, the comparative connections to Professor Farber's work are evident. And then finally, there's Jeremy Kessler, professor of law and my co-conspirator in matters legal historical at Columbia here since he arrived in 2015. His interests are in constitutional law, particularly the First Amendment and administrative law, but he has written widely, both in the law review world and in public-facing journals on legal history, legal theory, and politics and society. We're impatiently awaiting his book, Fortress of Liberty, The Rise and Fall of the Draft and the Remaking of American Law, which is due out shortly from Harvard University Press. But for today's discussion, the 2016 article is perhaps the most on point, The Political Economy of Constitutional Political Economy. So this is pretty much a dream team of scholars to engage with Professor Farber's new book, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. But first, as promised, we will start with the author herself.
Hi guys,
Professor Farber.
thank you for coming. It's really wild to reach this moment. I've been giving talks where I give the like flip, less serious version of how I started on the journey to this book. Maybe I'll do that, and then I'll do the more serious one for the people who I can actually count on to at least understand other forms of intellectual origin. So the like serious version. So when I went to grad school, I was at first interested in the study of religion, and then I abandoned that on the godless West Coast. I just lost my taste for it. And I started looking at tales of exciting adventure on the high seas and swashbuckling journeys of the early US Republic. And I found it deeply comical when I looked at the papers of all these people who were getting caught up in these swashbuckling adventures, which sometimes they were excited about and sometimes they were very, very not excited about. I found out how much time they spent moving all their paperwork around. So I thought that's very silly. And then I thought, wait a second, this is everywhere. I need to find out more about this. Another piece of this I realized only much later is that I was in grad school in the fall of 2008 when the economy or when it fell apart or the market crashed or whatever it is that I don't trust any words or categories about this kind of thing anymore. Just think we need to build them all up from scratch. And so surely inspired by that development, although I could not acknowledge that at the time, I started down this path of trying to understand how economic and market practices worked in people's lives on the ground during this incredibly turbulent political period when not only is there formal war, but there's the creation and destruction of political bodies that could have determined what that war actually was and what the identities were of people who were involved in it. When I was in grad school, I was sort of we read a lot of like the efflorescence of cultural history from the previous 10 years. So I learned a lot about how people felt about market crashes and commercial activity. And I grew increasingly determined that I would, at least I would rediscover things that people knew at least 100 years ago and figure out how it all worked. And in the case of insurance, I had to go back about 300 or 400 years to find people who would explain to me how things all worked. But I eventually got there through working through the historical sources. And as I read all of these books about how things worked, I was both fascinated. I understood this like real intricate world that these people were constructing, but I did not grow to trust them more than I had when I started reading what they wrote about their own market processes. In fact, sometimes I got the very distinct feeling that they were putting something over on me that I didn't quite understand. And so it was like this confluence of really real commercial activity where things of value really were being moved and exchanged, and this sort of thick but elusive world of political insistence about who we the merchants are and who we the insurers, merchant insurers are, that inspired me to write this book, which really became a sort of interrogation of the relationship between the performative political life, the self-concealment, and the very real commercial practice in this world of political turbulence. The other serious answer is that I fell in love with early modernity, and I'm not convinced it's over to this very day, early modernity, but I fell in love with the sort of the toolkit that allows me to question all these categories about what a state is, what a company is, what a market and an economy are, this sort of sense that all of these things are always coming into being, even as they very palpably shape people's lives and as they interrogate and test and build one another. So there's the academic version of the introduction story. So I had to learn a staggering amount of information to write the dissertation, and then another big chunk of information to transform it into a book, including just for the few pages of prologue of the book where I try to talk about what happens when you walk in the door of an insurance office, was after the dissertation was complete. And I sat down to write this and I thought, oh no, there's still a lot more that I don't understand when I need to think about how to explain what happens when you just walk in the door. What is it that you do? What is it that you're thinking? As I was trying to put this together into a book, also, there were all these really powerful narratives at play that I was trying my honest best to resist just at least long enough to understand whether they were a good fit. And one of these stories is the American Revolution and the making of a US state. Another is the sort of narrative of the capitalist stream turning into a capitalist river, turning into a capitalist waterfall in a capitalist ocean. I certainly knew that I wanted to resist the terminology of the economists, at least until I understood whether I felt it was appropriate for all of this world coming into being. So then I had to add some sort of deal with some source problems, some missing pieces that were harder to come by than the sort of main body of material where things get very loud, which is between the 1790s and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So I had a lot of help when I'm just doing this, and as I'm rereading parts of this book, I'm overcome by thinking about all of the people who helped me and all of the time that was afforded me to do it, and all the people who encouraged me to take the time to do it right, which is a rarer and rare luxury and a thing that I don't take for granted. So I just want to conclude, sorry, that's really loud. I just wanted to conclude with the gratitude for everyone who helped along the way and who is still helping. And as we all know, we write these single author monographs that stand on the shoulders of 10,000 people. So including now all many of you who are here today. So thank you.
I'll turn it over to Dr. Hart.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I've got, yeah, I'm delighted to actually be here in person as well. This is my first in-person event since I came to the US last year. So, but I also, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to read and comment on Hannah's book. So, diving in, I think what's really impressive about this book is its expansive chronology that goes all the way from the 17th through the 19th centuries and spans the Atlantic world. And in this wonderful book, Hannah argues for the central importance of an overlooked group of men, marine insurers, to the creation of the American state through a chaotic era of revolution, war, and nation building. Acknowledging that her topic could easily bore even the most dedicated of readers to tears, she implies that our tendency to find insurance dull and irrelevant is exactly what early America's marine insurers would have wanted. They were quite happy for attention to focus elsewhere, while they busied themselves with money-making and state-making, lodging themselves ever deeper in the fabric of American political economy. With a tale of some men who will be familiar to early American historians, and perhaps also a wider audience, like Robert Morris, for example, and others, though, who are also have been far less visible, like Jacob Barker, who gets his own chapter. Farber reveals exactly why we shouldn't overlook marine insurers, who in multiple ways were critical to the American political economy and to American state formation in their foundational eras. At every turn, the marine insurers in America's port cities were there to advance their business interests. And as they did so, they also underwrote the interests of the new United States. So Hannah begins her story with the beginnings of marine insurance in the British Atlantic world at Lloyd's of London. Lacking insurance offices in their own cities, colonial America's merchants relied on British policies to insure their ventures against war and natural disaster. Cutting the umbilical cord between colony and metropole proved difficult during the Revolution, as it did in all sorts of ways, with the American marine insurance sector still in its infancy. In particular, it was tricky for this sector to become genuinely American. And Farber stresses how marine insurance was always a transnational affair, and not even a revolution for independence could change that. So although Patriot-owned marine insurance grew to aid the American cause through facilitating privateering against Britain, the role of marine insurers was murky and contested. And here, Robert Morris stands in for the suspicion in which these men were held. And I agree with that, because I think Robert Morris is very suspicious too. It was in the 1790s that insurers developed a much tighter relationship with the state. Using the corporate form, marine insurance became nested within the governing system as newly chartered companies bound to the states. The symbiotic nature of state and insurance company became even greater as, quote, banks, insurance companies, and governments were interlocked from their origins. The United States was substantially underwritten by capital holders bound together in bodies politic. So Hannah's focus here explores the increasingly jarring clash between the idea of free trade and the closely woven nature of the financial institutions underwriting the American state, with marine insurers at the center of it all. So the era in which this union of interests occurred, so 1790 to 1810, was also one of renewed war thanks to the French. First of all, having a revolution, and then installing an aggressively acquisitive Napoleon. Farber shows how marine insurers influenced American policy by sealing their reputation as skilled commercial calculators. Their knowledge in this respect combated continued suspicion of insurers as not quite American or national enough, something they could never be because of their transnational interests and position. Tracing the fate of marine insurers from 1820 onwards, Hannah's story then settles on a narrative that saw them remain central to state making, but not quite in the way that they had been in the defining years of the early republic. Insurers like Jacob Barker had to turn to the imperial margins of the new nation if they were to realise the vast profits that they had enjoyed earlier on. It could be risky, and Barker and his partner Henry Eckford ended up on trial for conspiracy to defraud. Marine insurers more broadly suffered in an increasingly complex financial landscape. The state also got better at assessing risk as it got bigger and better at data collection, and insurance knowledge became a science in book form rather than a mystery that marine insurers could keep to themselves. Marine insurers themselves had a tendency to rest on their laurels, having accumulated great wealth from this golden era. And like others with memories of the revolutionary era, they spent a lot of their time burnishing their reputations as saviours of the nation. So I think Hannah is right to point out that this legacy was much more murky than the insurance men themselves might like to have imagined. And I think one of the joys of this book is her emphasis on a set of core tensions that were not resolved at the time and maybe have never been in the American political economy. And I see these core tensions as being the relationship between the public and private in economic activity. And I think this relationship is entangled as well with the private trader and their free will and state regulation. Also this tension between the hoary sort of balance of me and we versus we in American politics and culture. And going with that, the individual versus the collective, and also the concept of America as a national entity, as opposed to the transnational entanglements that were so important actually during its formative years. And it's an important book precisely because the story of marine insurance underscores how many of the oppositional forces that were supposed to exist in early American capitalism were in fact so tightly bound together. So tightly bound that we can't say that one triumphed over the other. And so Hannah joins other historians who've argued for bringing the state back into the early republic and antebellum eras. Brian, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I say below, but I don't know what other people Ballow, okay, thank you. Bill Novak, Gautam Rao, Brian Murphy, Richard John are a few that come to mind amongst many others. And what makes marine insurance such a compelling window on this story, I think, is that Hannah's able to show how these men were the linchpin between elements of this state that have not previously been tied together so thoroughly in our minds. Banking, foreign war, and the growth of the corporation come together here like never before. So what she achieves is a window on a majorly neglected group of people whose story really does change the way we look at the construction of the state in this era. What I also really like is how she captures the dynamic nature of this process. At each juncture, the corporate form, banking, war, the way in which marine insurers operated ensured a different aspect of state formation to unfold at each moment. And also, I think I like the constant connection of these processes to the international situation. Connections that can't be severed or written away existed between America and the Atlantic and the world, even if they might have been inconvenient to recognize for a nation under construction. But inevitably, I have things that I'd like to know more about. And I know it's common to say that, but I only have so many questions because it's such a thought-provoking book. It's the truth. In the introduction, I picked up on two statements that really piqued my interest, and I think I wanted to focus my questions on these. So first of all, Hannah writes in her introduction that, quote, "This book is about a practice, not a class, and it is about reorganization, not a coup." And I really like that she made the decision to make this book about state formation and not about a power grab by a bunch of wealthy white dudes. To be fair, she incorporates many voices into her book that expressed exactly the suspicion that this was about a power grab. She's not, at all starry-eyed about what they were up to. And also, she never falls victims to her subjects' rhetoric, of course, displaying a healthy suspicion of any of their claims merely to be operating for some sort of virtuous public good. And yet, as someone who has written about class in early America myself, I would have loved for her to think a bit more about its interpretive potential. What I see in these marine insurers is what other historians of the early republic have seen when they've been writing about class. Seth Rockman's Baltimore Strivers, for example, who create an environment in which failure is a moral judgment. Jessica Lepler's 1837 Panickers, who have taken this idea of fault for their personal failure to heart. Or Sharon Murphy's middle-class life insurance buyers who are trying to find a way to eliminate the risk of this tumultuous economic culture. Or Jonathan Levy's exploration of how risk is reconceptualized across all sorts of areas, including marine insurance, which, by the way, I think Hannah does a much better job of dealing with. So I want to ask her, why isn't this about class? What are the external social connections of her subjects? And what makes them not part of a class? I definitely endorse her idea to not make this a coup story, by the way. It's just that the class bit bothers me a little bit. And I wanted to know more about the decision to write the book like that. And secondly, and you've already touched on this in your opening comments, you stated that this book is not a history of capitalism. It's a study in political economy, and that's quoting you again in the introduction. And I totally agree with you. Though I put capitalism in the title of my own book recently, I'm very much in favour of the fact that labelling things with freighted terms often gets in the way of telling a useful story. And by making this about state formation and the practice of marine insurance and the creation of an American political economy, she's able to bypass the unproductive question of whether this was capitalism that hampered many past studies. And in fact, one of my greatest, graduate school frustrations, of course, I was in grad school a while ago, was reading the history of American capitalism literature. And coming from the UK, I was just in total consternation that people were arguing about this, because it seemed very unproductive, to try and work out whether capitalism started in the corner of southeastern Pennsylvania or not, when any European would know that it actually started in Poland in the 15th century, of course. But all of these kinds of arguments don't really get us anywhere, and I think bypassing them is really the way to go. And I think this is also a positive feature of the new history of capitalism, is that it doesn't get too bogged down in definitions. But I still want to ask Hannah to ponder where we go next for the audience. If we're going to escape the mire of the history of defining capitalism and write about political economy instead, what are the logical next, or what does she suggest are the next steps of writing about and creating a narrative of early American economic development. So that's a huge question, you know, just to.
Okay, class and capitalism. How many minutes? I don't even get to respond yet. Thank you for talking about that.
But the wonderful book, thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, you do not get to answer that. You can listen very carefully while not thinking about those questions to Charly Coleman's comments.
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful event and above all Hannah for inviting me to join the panel. I should also say that it's especially fitting that we're meeting at the Heyman Center because Hannah and I spent a year together as faculty fellows. I think around the time we were finishing our respective books, so it's doubly, triply good to be back. I think as should be abundantly clear by now, there's much to celebrate this evening. In this brilliantly realized monograph, The Underwriters of the United States. I will forego a point-by-point summary of the contents. Hannah and Emma have already introduced the book masterfully. Instead, I hope to raise points and questions that might spur further discussion. I should also say that my approach to the task is as an interlocutor, but also as something of an interloper. While Hannah and I both work on the long 18th century, I'm historian of France rather than of the United States. Nonetheless, Hannah's arguments, like the insurance companies at the center of her history, have a transnational scope and crisscross the Atlantic. So I would like to comment on how some of the book's themes figure in wider historical and historiographical terrains. That terrain, I think, can be mapped as a series of conjunctures or intersections between the state and the economy, as well as between, yes, capitalism and revolution. And I'm going to get to this question of class right away, because these themes of state and economy, capitalism and revolution would recall the critiques of Karl Marx and the Marxist tradition more generally. But Marx hardly appears in Hannah's book except to occasion disavow. We are told in the introduction that she has no interest in retelling the eternally recurring story of the rise of the bourgeoisie. Thank heavens. And to quote Emma, quoting Hannah, this is a study about practice, not a class. That's all fair enough. But I was repeatedly struck by Hannah's sensitivity to a crucial element in Marx's method. As with Marx, much of her argument unfolds dialectically in the play of productive oppositions. Indeed, one of the red threads of the book, if you'll bear the pun, is that the defenders of marine insurance continually oscillated between two seemingly contradictory stances. When challenging regulatory oversight or fiscal constraints, they presented their companies as private enterprises aimed at facilitating commerce. Yet they also championed their role as the founders and underwriters of civic institutions devoted to the preservation and extension of American power, even as they asserted independence from that very power. As Hannah ably shows, the Janus-based character of this position cannot be dismissed as rank opportunism. Rather, demand for autonomy and protection were two sides of the same coin. This deeply original interpretation flies in the face of conventional narratives in the history of political economy. In my field, for instance, of French history, much has been made of what Ray Blaufard and more recently Thomas Piketty have termed the great demarcation, or the disentangling of property and sovereignty. Both Blaufard and Piketty, the watershed moment for this development was, of course, you guessed it, the French Revolution, when the possession of things and the exercise of political power were violently wrenched apart, thereby enshrining a legal regime under which citizens were deemed capable of absolute ownership. A key moment in this great demarcation was the nationalization of ecclesiastical property, which was to set the stage for its eventual individuation. Hannah presents a rather different view, and I think a rather compelling perspective. The very notion of underwriting in the three senses of the term that she provides belies these kinds of teleological narratives, not least because marine insurers knowingly and repeatedly elided state authority and market power under the shared framework of constitutionalism. Market making and state making went hand in hand. More generally, the history of marine insurance compels us to reconsider the relationship between the state and the economy. Indeed, at least for me, one of Hannah's signal contributions is to highlight the ways in which insurance corporations develop modes of self-governance in tandem with the government, properly speaking, or as we normally mean. As she puts it in chapter 3, and here I want to quote, corporate and political constitution making shaped one another materially and ideologically. Corporate charters produced bodies politic, which had to be situated in relationship to their host states, to citizens, and to the federal union as a whole. Incorporation was not only an economic or a partisan process, but also a chapter in the history of American state making. So, just as the United States Constitution was predicated on a balance of powers and federated sovereignty, so did insurance companies view themselves as vehicles for distributing risk among shareholders, both internationally and internationally. There's part of this argument that reminds me of Karl Polanyi, who held that the modern nation state and the market economy arose as reciprocal forces rather than in opposition. But Hannah, I think, goes even further. She, of course, argues for the ways in which corporate interests solidified national interest and vice versa, but she insists even more than Polanyi, and here I think she casts beyond that paradigm, that it was not merely a matter of viewing the economy as embedded in society. Putting the political back into political economy also means recognizing that social forces are always already embedded in, or in Hannah's formulation, constituted by structures of economic power. But those structures are not impersonal. What Hannah's telling, they follow the experiences and aspirations of marine insurers, Robert Morris, Samuel Blodgett, Jacob Barker, and through a series of tumultuous moments, the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812, and all the way through the antebellum period. Moreover, they were reflected in the very dynamics of incorporation, which, as Hannah notes, quite literally pertain to the creation of new bodies politic, endowed with legal personalities and the capacity for self-governance. She charts a rather curious shift over time, whereby the labor involved in this process of incorporation gradually became occluded. One is tempted, again, to think of Marx, and here of Marx's theory of alienation. But Hannah shows how capitalists themselves proved willing to write themselves out of their own history when it served their purposes. This is why there are so many jokes about the comical tedium of insurance and those who sell it. But there is much more going on here, as Hannah shows. Insurers have had such success in receding into the background precisely because their history is so closely linked with that of the American Republic that it has become thoroughly naturalized. And like all great histories, Hannah's account at once denaturalizes marine insurance by restoring it to its contingent context, but also framing the terms under which such an arcane political economic phenomenon came to seem natural in the first place. So I want to devote the remainder of my time to some questions that occurred to me. All of them touch on how Hannah addresses the role of contingency in the emergence of both political and economic formations. The first question has to do with the broader intellectual, cultural, and even religious forces that might have shaped the practice of marine insurance. So scholars such as Jonathan Sheehan and Joy Warman have charted the course over the 18th century of a language of self-organization that rendered intelligible the ways in which the social, political, economic, and natural realms seem to produce order imminently out of chaos. Think of Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, but Sheehan and Warman also show how the promise and perils of self-organization encourage participation in lotteries, insurance schemes, and the stock market. So I wonder if American marine insurers made similar claims about how the world worked. Did it work, at least sometimes, according to the unintended consequences of self-organization? And if so, did they couple their faith in calculating risk with a belief that their success in such dangerous ventures served as a sign of God's favor? not only in their private dealings, but also in the fate of the new republic. In other words, could the myth of American exceptionalism be grafted onto the myth of an eternal lex mercatoria? In other words, was there a confessional or religious dimension to underwriting insurance policies, just as there seemed to be in the divine underwriting of the American constitutional order? Now, while I don't think one can claim that Hannah identifies maritime insurance with political providentialism, it is remarkable how enduring the practices associated with marine insurance turned out to be. And this brings me back to the dialectical nature of many of the book's arguments. Even in the midst of war, revolution, insurers had an uncanny knack for clutching victory and profits from the jaws of defeat, and for tacking back and forth between national and transnational sources of legitimation, between civic mindedness and the protection of corporate interest. Although Hannah notes proposals floated for the establishment of a public insurance office or offices during the early republic, this alternative never seemed truly viable. My question then is, if the insurance company became too big to fail, is it also so deeply ingrained in the American constitutional order that it can no longer be uprooted? So is this a story of contingencies leading time and again to the same inescapable conclusion? Finally, Hannah describes how insurance companies launch, in her words, a confidence gambit of staggering scale, a successful risk-reducing initiative about which Americans and their legislatures often have little to say. I wonder if she could say more here on this point. If, as insurers frequently claimed, they had mastered techniques of information management and risk calculation that rendered them indispensable to governments and to the economy, what would become of mass participation in civic life, in a kind of civic economic life? Does the sheer complexity of the operations involved in global finance point to a glaring contradiction at the heart of late capitalist democracy? And if so, it seems to me after reading Hannah's book that this contradiction would not have to wait for what Daniel Bell would later call the post-industrial society. The possibility was there from the beginning. I could ask many more questions. Perhaps they would be more of a reflection of what's on my mind than what was on Hannah's. But all the same, I thank her again for giving me the chance to think with her and with her marvelous work.
Thank you so much. Now, turn things over to Jeremy Kessler.
Thanks so much, everybody. Particularly, Hannah, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I thought it was a wonderful book and a really awe-inspiring blend to read narrative and analytic history that really just sum, and I learned a tremendous amount from it. I too want to end up asking about your idea that you were telling a history of practice rather than a history of class, but I'm going to do it as my mandate was through maybe more through legal theory and state theory than Emma and Charly touched upon. On the state theory piece, I first just wanted to say that, because you mentioned in particular the sort of early modern reformation as a scholar, I really think the early modern kind of move you make and you consciously introduce in the weak state, strong state American historiography sort of resolves the debate. You know, Hannah basically argues that, you know, it's not so much that we have a weak state or a strong state in the late 18th and early 19th century, we have an early modern state. And if you look comparatively, there's just nothing that surprising here about what American historians continually are surprised by. I don't even think that approach requires jettisoning the Bavarian association with a centralized national bureaucracy with modernity. It just requires recognizing that modernity happens at different times in different places. So that's just something I wanted to flag at the outset. It's almost like an independent contribution to the American historiography. So in order to get to a reframing of is this a history of a practice or a history of a class, I wanted to ask some questions about two concepts that you introduce in the introduction, and then they sort of recur throughout the chapters. The first is this idea of insurance as a form of governance in tension with the state. And then the second is this idea of insurance as an autonomous form of governance. So I want to talk a little bit about what's a form of governance in tension with the state and what's an autonomous form of governance. So starting with insurance as a form of governance in tension with the state. I found that a very striking formulation. And perhaps because of my formation, I tend to think that underlying any distinctive form of governance, there's going to be some distinctive rationality or some distinctive power, or both, usually both. And so I was trying to think as I read about, okay, what is the distinctive rationality / power that might be undergirding this insurance as a form of governance in tension with the state? And I came up with three. I'm sure there are many more. One would be there's a kind of legal rationality or power that's distinctive to insurance as a form of governance, and that leads that form of governance to be in tension with the state. The second possibility is that there might be a sort of managerial or organizational rationality or power underlying the insurance form of governance that would bring it into tension with the state. And I should note that when I was coming up with that second undergirding rationality or power, I wanted to use the phrase actuarial rationality. But as I learned from your book, and in some ways I almost think it's an understated insight that you introduce your readers to. This is a non-actuarial form of rationality. There are several very arresting sentences throughout the chapters where Hannah makes this point, that even as there is a rise of actuarial science in this period, insurers are using this non-actuarial form of rationality. So that's why I went with managerial or organizational rationality. One could also say scientific, but that's also sort of vague. And so what I want to suggest and really kind of ask you, press you on, is I'm not convinced that the legal rationality that I think I can see associated with the insurance form of governance in this book, nor the managerial, organizational, or scientific rationality that I can see associated with the insurance form of governance. I'm convinced they're there. I'm not convinced that they're in tension with the state. And so just sort of very briefly, what I mean by that, what I'm sort of thinking, and I'm very open to correction, is that so with respect to the legal rationality that might be undergirding the insurance form of governance, particularly the lex mercatoria, as you know, it's true that the lex mercatoria is distinct from state law in many respects. But most of your subjects and interlocutors, kind of Alexander Hamilton, maybe most distinctively, seem to be totally comfortable with it. So I want to draw this distinction between a distinct rationality and one that's in tension with the state. I'm not sure that the lex mercatoria is in any kind of profound way in tension with the state, at least not the state as it's lived by your subjects in this period. It might be a supplement to state law. It's a dialogue with state law, but I don't see it so much as a tension with state law as it's being mobilized by your subjects. And similarly, I have that instinct with respect to the managerial organizational rationality. The very idea that even as actuarial science is taking off in other realms, in other areas of the state, there is this room for this non-actuarial form of risk assessment. Again, I'm not sure, I don't see the tension there. Where I am inclined to see a more profound tension would be in a third kind of rationality that might undergird the insurance form of governance, and that is economic rationality or economic power. That there could be, and I do see in the pages of the book, evidence of a concatenation of economic power, interests, and even knowledge that is at some tension with at least some conceptions of the state in this period, right? And that is one way I would re-enter this question of, are you telling the history of a practice or a history of a class? I think you're inclined to emphasize the legal and managerial, organizational, or scientific rationalities that make up the distinctive insurance form of governance. But those forms of rationality, I don't see as in tension with the state, whereas the economic piece seems to be where my instincts would lead me to suggest there might be a profound encounter and a contest. But that would then move you towards telling the history of the class and the class relations, and maybe less a history of the practice. I don't want to use much time. I'll say with respect to this idea of insurance as an autonomous form of governance, the second concept. There are a couple of different ways that I think I and folks in law schools tend to think about, and state theorists tend to think about autonomy. One idea would be that autonomy means causal independence. Second would be that autonomy is freedom from intervention by other authoritative legal or political bodies. A third concept of autonomy would be self-sufficiency. And I just wanted to flag that I think you identify a really interesting kind of fourth riff on autonomy, which involves loyalty and disloyalty. That you know early on that there's something about the autonomous form of virtue self-governance that enabled them potentially not to be loyal. At other times, you describe most of your subjects as patriots. So I'd kind of be curious to hear more about that. But with respect to those forms of autonomy, this is a way of maybe getting at the earlier question. I don't think you're saying that the insurance form of governance is causally independent from the state, not entirely. I do think you're identifying ways in which it was free from intervention at times, and certainly wanted to be free from intervention at times. I don't think, and I'm unsure about self-sufficiency. And I think kind of specifying which form of autonomy you mean might also get us back to this question of how might this be rewritten, or might be not as far from the histories of class that you're sort of criticizing. That's sort of your friend suggests you want to. So I'll stop there and just invite. Let's get it.
All right, thank you very much. So we'll turn over the floor to Hannah to respond. Those of you online can start formulating your questions in the chat. Those of you in the audience can start formulating them in your head.
How long should I take on these? I have things called class and capitalism.
Yes. Take 10, 15 minutes. We'll see how things pile up in the questions.
Oh, wow.
I'll nudge you.
Oh, thank you guys. This is incredible. This is really wonderful. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done for me here. My paper of questions is filled with so many notes that I might have to go back and ask for more clarification as I work through them a little bit. And I'm also sort of torn between trying to patch together the answer of the scholar whose book is done and who is trying to put it to bed and move on to the next thing, and to respond with the humility of somebody who's like always trying to think new things, and to respond to these questions as live matters, which I tend to believe is more interesting for an audience. All right, so maybe I'll start with Jeremy's question, since there are sort of pressure in my mind, and it gets back into this class question a little bit. I did find the sort of overall structure, a theory of autonomy, somewhat elusive, and in part because I'm tracing a system that is so resolutely resistant to theorize itself on anything except its own terms, and this sort of gets to the religion question as well. And what I was looking for was a space to test whether that could be something other than economic rationality at work. And what I fell into was talking about this sort of mythology of self-governance, again, in the absence of a world that's legally rational. Under what conditions would we expect legal rationality in? I mean, I sure there are theories of this that are not where I'm coming from, But in a world where no rationality of the political system can be expected, and where there's such a vast disjuncture between what people do when they're trying to stay economically alive for one 6-month period at a time, and what they say they do when they're wearing their other hats as citizens or their other hats as political economists. Those simply do not mesh. And in a world where the very idea of a state or a company is changing, and if you look closer at any merchant's individual books, you find that, of course, they don't know. They don't know what they have particularly at any given time, and they won't know for a while. So they're always operating in outside of whatever theory they might be constructing on the fly. And so I was thinking through a lot of times, what are the intellectual assets that they have to just set up as boundary markers according to which they navigate. And it is certainly extremely opportunistic, but there is this incredible ballast that comes with the insurance tradition, which is bound up in the broader tradition of what it means to be a merchant. So that also, the class question is now banging on the door again. So it's not quite superstition, because what they do really works. But it's not purely rational, because some of the things that they do have this like sticky, customary baggage to them. Some of the things that they do work because they agree that that's how things are going to work. And I'd be reluctant to reduce that to rationality. And I'm also reluctant to reduce over hundreds of years that anyone who sort of opens a volume of merchant law to try to decide what to do, I'm reluctant to say that the most important thing about that is that that's a person who's now in a class, or even to use all the dodges that we do to try to talk about class when we know people are coming and going out of this world constantly, which is to say, well, they're in a class and a practice of, they're making themselves into a class or something, right, in the traditional fashion. It's a set of mental habits that I would follow. Maybe a habit is a better way to say it, that's somewhere between, I guess, the almost patronizing broad term of culture, where we have to attach certain meanings to things. We have to stay away from this like an irrational intellectual structure, which I'm skeptical about. But this combination of habit, obedience, and opportunism in a world when very little else can be counted upon, it is that which helps people identify themselves as merchants. And it is to a significant degree the practice of insurance that makes merchants what they are. I mean, it's impossible to quantify, it's probably overstated, but there is no doubt that this is the system, one of the systems that's like applying this gravitational pull to the community of merchants by time after time after time in all of these different opportunistic situations, being in a position to issue rulings that matter in economic terms, rulings about what the appropriate course of action for a merchant is in any situation. So is that managerial? I'm not sure. I have to sort of think through that more with you. But I do think that if we think about these habits, mythology, sort of hammered out on the fly ways of functioning in an uncertain and fragmented political world, that is something that's in tension from whatever the state might be emanating as it tries to construct its own self and defend its own territory, because that is a very different set of, people would describe the state the same way in the early modern world as something that's sort of contingently and opportunistically grabbing at moments to adjudicate, to establish order. And that is not what these people are doing. And the amazing thing about the US case is that this state formation is happening, I want to say late enough that some of these moves that insurers are making are so nakedly visible to us, when they are strategizing about how to form state law according to their own standards, when they are determining what the nationality of property actually is. Like that is a conscious choice. Is it purely rational and opportunistic? I mean, in a way, it's the patriotism itself that makes this more complicated, because they think they're doing this on behalf of the country, but it is on behalf of a country that they visualize that is devoted to serving their economic interests. And they're increasingly right. And then the other sort of giant contingency that's overshadowing this all is that the United States is not pressed hard enough in the 1790s and the 1800s from the ocean side, that this sort of house of cards falls down and sort of lasts long enough to be reinforced and then reinforced again. And that's sort of the big contingency moment for me. And then the beautiful thing about this story, I think, is that you see them start to paper this over afterward with sort of more of a form of providentialism that can be made authentically into national providentialism, because they succeeded in making the state into something that looked like what they wanted to be. And so I've read things that talk about class in this world, and you can tell this story about a co-option of a emerging class co-opting a state. And ultimately, I think, again, taking the more humble response as sort of an intellectual project that's always in process, I don't think it's very interesting. I think that that's a story that's been told, and I think that people have done this work to break down who merchants are and what their relationship to American capitalism is. And it's amazing stuff is being written now about the more people who are more directly involved in financing the early West, and some of them are very much the people in this book, and like Hamilton, who's drawing on this very same toolkit. But I think that it needs to be, the story really needs to be nationally decentered. And I think it's confusing to try to make it about a group of people who go in and out of this business, who are not on the same political page, who don't all get rich. And I think if you look at the state as the system that's making itself, then you also have to look at the other systems that interact with it. And again, it's tricky because they do think they are aligned, but the ways that they're pulling money out of the universe that they live in can only happen if they both grab the state and then are also in this position to work around it at the same time, because they do interpret laws, they shape laws, and then they defy them at the same time, and they don't make that public, they don't make that part of what they do. But I think it's deeply rooted in this sort of mythological practice where it's okay to bribe a port official if it's the port official that everybody knows that you're supposed to bribe. That's a world that I have to take really seriously. If not capitalism, where next? I have some interest in sort of pushing forward in time and in sort of pushing deeper into the legal sphere and seeing how many other, like whether we can continue to dissolve the early 19th century corporation or the mid 19th century corporation and its relationship with like state constitutions. Michael and I were talking about this in class this week. It was very exciting. And to see where else we take for granted that systems have been formed and rationalized and made routine, where laws have been passed and in fact, like you've just pushed the negotiation under a different part of the rug. And that's so that's a trajectory that interests me. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Any further questions?
So again, if you're in internet land, type your questions into the Q&A, into the chat. Chat, right? Yes. And any questions in the audience? Yes, sir.
Can I ask a very naive question, but one that speaks to your emphasis on practice? How on earth do you run a profitable marine insurance agency, given the rate of loss on ships, in the age of sail and ocean warfare?
Yeah, so you charge really high rates, is one thing that you do, and you are a sort of a company that serves your own community and draws in money from shareholders from a little bit of a broader community. You read the news and you apply your merchant's 4 cents to what you think is going to go on in the oceans, and how. So you apply your navigational commercial expertise. You apply the latest political knowledge that you have. You charge high rates and you get lucky, and that's also a big U.S. strategy. There's a bunch of like insurance outfits in Spain, I think, that go broke like Napoleon comes, so that he's nearby, so that's a bigger problem for them. But it is a factor that the United States is able to just year after year roll the dice in its global commerce and is coming out better than 50-50 in what they're able to get through. So high risk, high reward is the world that they're living in and that they're adept in navigating. And then the second big backstop that they add to that is this relationship to the state, which is also able to raise revenue, which is coming from customs, which is coming from global trade as well. But people see and understand that as a stabilizing factor. Like once you create these distinct institutions, you can make them lean on each other. Like literally it's a house of cards, and the banks are involved in as well. And then they're lucky that nobody really quite kicks out the layers underneath for a long enough period of time.
Thank you. I found this really interesting. So thank you for sharing this. The conversation that the panel had, one of the concepts that kept on coming to mind was legal pluralism, particularly when we were discussing the tension, if there is one, between Western Victoria and state law. And so I'm wondering, it sounds like from how you describe the mentality of insurance underwriters, that they would resist any sense that there's a legal pluralism here, particularly insofar as they get to define what state law looks like. But I'm wondering if you see that as a frame that's useful in understanding insurance, and if that might be one of the many afterlives of this project.
Yeah, I think, again, sort of viewing this project in the dilemma of the insurance business and how to navigate this political world that's always shaping. Always having more opportunities to choose your legal system is the best thing. There is a real discrepancy between how some legal histories talk about where insurance cases are adjudicated and the sort of basically the wresting of insurance disputes out of arbitration and the sort of triumph of the domestic legal system, and then it becomes national level rather than state. It's just hard for me to see that trajectory if I'm living on the level of what people are doing. There's still, it is undecided. You can still bring cases to state or federal court system for like this giant swath of the 19th century after this question is supposedly determined. People are still going to arbitration. In the back office, they're still making deals that keep things out of the courts. So Yeah, I think that is a world that they live in. And again, if we're just, maybe we just are living, we should just be living in a world where we say, yeah, that's the world of an economic maximizer. You go to where you think you're gonna get the best deal for yourself. But there is also an opportunity every time to like infuse your knowledge and ideas and precedents into whichever piece of the legal system you think is most likely to host them. And so there's this like pushing in continually of like merchant expertise into the legal system. And it's just too complex, I think, to be reduced to rationality, because it drags this whole history behind it wherever it goes. And in so doing, it preserves this like concept of autonomy that remains really useful and it's like impressive to legislators. Like, look, you wrote a big book on this. Wow, like you must know what you're talking about. This must be the right way to do things. So I think that sort of pulls us through the era of like of the sort of teleology of rationality.
Yeah. I'm trying to formulate a question to think about how your work fits with recent scholarship on American Revolution. And I might put it this way, that the big war in your story for the merchants, the underwriters, in some ways is a Napoleonic war. That was a really unsettling war. And that the War of Independence outcome of it was really much more limited in your narrative than it has been, say, for historians who talk about slavery, who talk about real property versus personal property. And then if you look, so in other words, if we locate the United States in Atlantic world, the real system break came with the Napoleonic War rather than the War of Independence, and the merchants might have ended up pretty much the same through the American War of Independence. That's what I'm trying to get you to speak to, those two events and after that.
Yeah, so so I think the American Revolution, in as much as there's so much to be said about merchant involvement and merchant autonomy and the differences there, the financial structures that they resort to, the main differentiation is like between wartime or sort of intense fear of war and not intense fear of war. And when things get hot, insurance formations go, a lot of people like run to the insurance office, and there's the high rollers like show up there to see what bets they want to make, and then it like subsides. And the American Revolution isn't really so different in that respect. And the big break comes with the making of new financial infrastructure that's tied into the state, which then is this thing that corporations can really dig into. And I don't think you can separate the economics aspect of that from the sort of cultural, political valence of being able to make that financial connection with the state. Both of those things are tremendously reassuring. They're stabilizing. The state stabilizes the corporations, and the corporations stabilize the state. There's this expectation of ongoing, like basically eternal revenue out of the state, which I'm also interested in writing about next. The sort of expectation of returns that transforms the institutional environment there. So yes, I mean, and then there's the great thing that comes at the time the U.S. has this like giant merchant marine, and the British and French are locked up with each other. So there is like this big open door if you can manage this high risk, high reward investment. Meanwhile, the ways in which the state itself is this risky investment remain generally occluded, and because when people want to talk about national risk and national enterprise, they don't want to think in those terms, and so the connections are sort of sidelined.
One last question, as long as it is not about capitalism.
I'm gonna try to not make it about capitalism. In reading primary documents, and that's where my question is, was there a sense of an opposition or a relationship with like a regulatory edifice, or was there one? mean, that is kind of a capitalist question, but was there the sense of a regulatory edifice national or transnational?
No, I mean, no, not really. They're thinking first and foremost about the regulatory edifice of the insurer, who is an interpreter, who is in theory just the interpreter of merchant practice or international law in whatever articulation we call it in whatever particular decade we're in, or sort of national law, but not really. I mean, they really just on the ground, they really just don't see that as part of the state's business to handle. I think that comes with some of the entitlement to engage in things like smuggling. We are coming out of a British imperial history where a lot of smuggling is like accepted as, you know, within a fragmented empire that has multiple goals in its own right. It's sort of a normal bad behavior. And so when you have a new US government, to some degree, that attitude has already existed. And because there's the opportunity to set the rules, you don't even have to feel as guilty as they did about smuggling sugar in the 18th century, which they didn't really feel, as far as I know, they didn't really feel guilty about smuggling sugar.
Yeah. Not in the slightest.
No, it was I mean, I thought maybe you might have known some conscience tormented fellow or two, but no, I mean, they really don't. And so when they're in a position to set the rules, how much more so did they feel entitled to just claim that they occupy a space that has a legitimacy that doesn't really align so well with law. I mean, law is a disaster in the early US republics. Michael and I have also been talking about. And so they're not necessarily wrong either. And that's like the early republic legacy that we have to live with.
Thank you. So we're at time. So let me thank the organizers, thank the audience, thank the panelists, and above all, thank Hannah Farber for this wonderful book.